If you remember the first showdown of Izzy Adesanya vs Robert Whittaker, Izzy threw his signature check hook counter many times, and this is what happened. Going into the rematch, Robert Whittaker made some critical changes, and when Adesanya attempted to throw his signature lateral step check hook counter, Rob was amazingly able to defend every single one of them. This begs the question, how did Robert Whittaker manage to adapt to Izzy's signature counter so effectively the second time around? There's something really shocking about these attempts, and they reveal a frightening surprise that I am almost positive that you didn't notice. I'll tell you exactly what this is later on in the video, and you're really not going to want to miss this. Along with this, there are a lot of interesting technical adjustments happening back and forth that you might have missed. This is important to consider because this completely transformed the flow of their rematch, and ultimately this forced Izzy to adapt, and how he adapted might actually surprise you after I reveal what he did throughout this match. At first glance, to some people this match probably didn't look like much due to the long durations of inactivity, but this video might change your mind in how you see this fight. At the end of this, I promise that you'll have a better grasp of their fighting IQs after I break down the tactics they use, the strategies, and some important details behind what their corners wanted them to do. As a matter of fact, some of the advice from Rob's corner was pretty effective advice that worked for Jan Blachowicz too. Surprisingly, there were some cool parallels between Jan Blachowicz and Whittaker when it came to very specific tactics. This video will be worth your time as a martial artist or a fan if you're looking to improve your understanding of high-level fighting. Overall, there's some really cool stuff I discovered, and I'm looking forward to showing you those things, so stay tuned and we'll get right into it. In order to understand how this fight played out, first it's important to have a little background on Izzy Adesanya's fighting style. I'll explain his style briefly for those who aren't familiar with my previous work on this channel. Izzy is a very patient fighter, and he builds his offense largely from feinting. For this reason, it's not too uncommon to see long stints of inactivity at times. Izzy often requires a reaction that he could capitalize on and doesn't risk advancing forward until he weighs the risk factors before coming in. In order to accomplish this patient approach, one of his signature attack styles is to use a hip feint. In order to make your feints or fakes effective, it's very important that you establish your attacks first. This is typically why you would often see Izzy throw a lot of leg kicks. When he establishes the threat of a kick, it allows him to set up other strikes instead with the hip feint. For example, against Rob, he would throw his leg kicks to establish the threat of a kick. Then he would use the hip feint to sell that threat to transition into a jab cross. This happens to be a signature move he uses against various opponents. The hip feint can be used to set up other attacks too. Instead of doing the hip feint into a jab cross, Izzy might switch to doing a hip feint into a step up inside the leg kick. Or he might throw a hip feint to draw his opponent into defending, then throw the kick again. The key point that I'm trying to emphasize here is that the hip feint can be used to create specific look that can turn into a variety of other attacks that are hard to predict. The most meaningful use of the feint was when he managed to drop Rob with the hip feint. Here Izzy will hip feint to throw his hands across his body as though he was going to feint a kick. Then he goes to do it again, he hip feints and throws the hand across his body to feint a kick, but you're going to notice that Rob is going to lift his leg up and try to block as though a kick was coming, but Izzy slams his cross right down the opening of the guard. So now we have the gist of his offensive style out of the way, you can see why it might take him a little while to establish his offense. There's a lot of setup going on before the attack can land. The big theme of this fight was that Izzy was the one mostly directing the rhythm of the sequences. Most of what happened in the fight was based off Izzy's own approach. Whether it was him feinting to set up shots or Rob executing his counters off of Izzy's advancements, it was pretty clear that if someone was going to get hit, whether it was Izzy or Rob getting hit, it was most likely due to Izzy initiating the start of that sequence. If you followed Izzy Adesanya, you're probably fully aware of his abilities to counterpunch his opponents. Based on his history, Izzy's proven how dangerous it could be to advance on him. This makes it easier to understand why Rob was a little bit more cautious this time around. Robert Whittaker doesn't exactly have the stone chin of Marvin Vettori to withstand the punishment, but he does have the IQ to attack on safer terms. Okay then, so how did Rob manage to get his attacks going? Izzy is a long-range fighter with good distance management skills. Combined with his counterpunching, Rob had a challenge getting in range against these particular set of attributes. This is where we get to the really interesting part of the fight, where I reveal how he did this and how Izzy managed to answer it. Before we get into that, give me a minute to talk about the high quality smart wallets by Exter. These are wallets by Exter. These are high quality wallets, and they're actually a great alternative if you're looking for something better or looking for a gift for an occasion right around the corner. For the classic Parliament, it has this really easy to use card ejection feature for quick card access. The card tracker that you could get for your wallet is very slim and it fits perfectly into the wallet. The card can also be used with your phone for tracking if it ever gets lost. It has a solar panel for convenient charging. The app setup is super easy and the interface is really simple. You just touch the icon to track your phone. The bonus features are that you can also take selfies using the card as a remote, or even use the card to track your phone if you lose it. The wallets are really nice and slim. Unlike conventional wallets, this is actually my old wallet before I upgraded to the much better Extra alternative. One of the important features of this wallet is the RFID protection. I can't stress enough this day and age how important it is to protect your personal finances. You can head over to Extra's website at extra.com and use my link in the description to get yourself a discount. In order to understand the difficulty of this matchup, you first have to ask yourself, how do I get into the range of the longer opponent? The short answer is that you either go after them or you wait for them to come to you. It's very obvious that Rob didn't want to take the initiative to go after him as much, but he still managed to make it a competitive fight by capitalizing on the times when Izzy would commit forward into range. By understanding this, you start to grasp the heart of Whittaker's strategy. Exploit the openings of Izzy's advancements. You see, history has a strange way of repeating itself. Back when Rob fought Izzy for the first time, Rob was heavily criticized for rushing in. This might surprise you, but going to the rematch, Rob claimed that his game plan for the rematch might just be a lot of the same thing from last time. I know, as crazy as that sounds, Rob actually had some merit in what he was saying. Rob did make some mistakes, but he also had a lot of effective things that he was doing in the first fight that proved to be useful in the rematch as well. However, he doesn't get a lot of recognition for this, so let's explore those details. Izzy's offensive approach is largely based off of feinting. When he feints, he stylistically prefers to feint out of range to bait a reaction in order to create openings. He feints from this safe range because if they simultaneously try to time a counter, they won't be able to reach him. So when he feints, he reads the opponent is dropping their hands, and when that happens, that's when he knows when it's good to close the distance. This is what makes Izzy hard to counter. On top of his reach, his careful approach to feinting adds many defensive layers that opponents have to breach you just to land their shots. This is the beauty of Whittaker's approach from the first fight. Whittaker understood the distancing Izzy was operating in, and he actually was able to nullify Izzy's safe range often by using his signature stepping double jab. When Izzy feints, he'll sometimes drop his hands and step forward to commit towards selling the attack. And in that split moment that you feint, you tend to leave yourself open because this is kind of a natural process of feinting. Just think of a feint as an empty attack. He sells the feint but drops his hand in the process of selling it. This is why Izzy often feints out of range in case they do attack. However, Rob would time his advancement by throwing his jabs stepping forward into Izzy's safe range during Izzy's feint attempts. This puts Izzy on the back foot and it makes it hard for him to counter back while he's attempting to reset. This is actually a strategy I talked about almost a year ago in my breakdown of Izzy Adesanya's fighting style, and in it, along with Whittaker, I also showed how other fighters managed to find success with the same approach as well. I mentioned brief moments where Brad Tavares was able to nullify Izzy's safe range by reaching forward with his stepping jabs to put Izzy on the back foot, and even to recent memory, Jan Blachowicz was able to use this to some degree of success as well. This is just an example from sparring. I typically spar with different people who like to bait me out since I like to counterpunch. I often get baited from feints, but I tend to recognize that they do it out of range. Well, opponents, when they're usually trying to bait you out, they'll throw a feint, wait for you to swing, and then they'll come back to counter you. But if you throw in volume closing that gap, the shot selection can disrupt the rhythm, and you might actually catch them as they try to counter you back. So you notice that my sparring partner is actually going to feint, but he's going to do it outside of a range where none of us can really attack to bait me out. But I kind of knew this, so I would step forward and then bring myself into range. And what this does is it puts me into his safe range, but I get closer, so he's going to no longer be in that safe range, and just instantly puts him on the back foot. And here I just double up on my shot, and if he was to try to counter me back, he ends up getting hit by my jab. And then for good measure, I'm even deeper into his punching range, and I just follow up with another shot. And here notice that Izzy's going to feint out of range, and then as he does it, Rob's going to close that distance to get into his safe range. You're going to see that his range overlaps with Izzy's safe range. Now he's able to attack.
Any other good adjustments throughout the fight?
He tripled up his jab at one point. That was a good adjustment. That's how I think he caught me with this. I can't remember.
The ability to nullify that range during the feint and throw in volume can throw off the opponent's rhythm as they're attempting to bait. I bring this up because it highlights why something like this can be useful when you're throwing it on Izzy like how Whittaker was able to do. Coming into the rematch, Rob continued using this tactic all throughout the fight and he found a lot of success timing his stepping double jabs. You gotta keep in mind that Rob was really doing this when Izzy was feinting, and it works because when Izzy is feinting, he's actually committing forward, and Rob is using this against him to get into range. This allowed him to get through to the safe range but also put Izzy on the back foot. It's worth mentioning that Izzy has two methods of baiting. The first method is that he'll feint out of range with an empty attack, but the problem is that when you're feinting out of range, it doesn't always reliably work because the threat is so far, and this is where he'll escalate his bait by throwing a real jab to bait them forward. In those situations where Izzy does throw a real jab, you would often see Rob using his stepping jab, but he'll often parry the jab in return of his own stepping jabs to put Izzy on the back foot instead. So here's the thing, Rob repeatedly did this throughout the fight, but Izzy was fully aware of what Rob was trying to do by timing his advancement, so he purposely tried to bait Rob out with feints or jab probes so he could counter back. Pretty much this dynamic encompasses the rhythm of the fight, where you had one fighter in Rob looking to time his entries, and then you had the other fighter in Izzy looking to feint and bait in order to capitalize on those entries. Both fighters did find success to varying degrees. Rob's corner actually wanted him to keep his head on Izzy's left side, and to explain why they wanted that, this actually complements Rob's stepping jab. Typically when Izzy starts in an orthodox stance, when Rob comes in with his stepping double jab, he does this by slipping his head low and onto Izzy's left side because this is what referred to as the weak side angle. To explain this better, Rob's going to throw his slipping jab and he's going to take his head and put it on the left side of Izzy's lead foot. This is the outside of his lead foot where it's considered the weak angle, and it's considered the weak angle because it's kind of hard to hit in that area because you would typically need to turn your body, and you're going to see Izzy turning his body towards Rob. Izzy showed some brilliant moments countering Rob's timing double jabs. He knew Rob was coming in to time the double jabs with his head onto the left side, so Izzy would feint to probe to get him to come forward on purpose, and then he would use that against him to hit him with a lead leg head kick. This was a pretty creative way of answering Rob's double jabs because it allowed Izzy to cover his weak angle using the kick. Where from what I was able to study, I was only able to see one clear shot where Izzy landed this possibly clean. It appeared most of the time Rob did a really good job of keeping his guard up as he advanced forward. Izzy's tactic was sound, but Rob's defensive execution was excellent. As a result, you would see a weird kind of stalemate going on between who could land the craft best. A really interesting thing Izzy mentions in the interview on the channel about the fight was that he felt more comfortable fighting in southpaw. To me, this seems to make a lot of sense since Rob was attacking quite frequently using stepping double jabs, mostly when Izzy was in orthodox. Keep in mind, Izzy was fully aware of Rob's tendency to advance on his feints from their first encounter. In fact, he actually knocked Rob down using his signature counter. I'll explain how this counter works real quick, but this is actually taught by Izzy's striking coach, lightweight fighter Brad Quick Rydell. Go check out his channel. So in short, how this works is that when the opponent is about to come in, you're going to take that lead foot and you're going to step out laterally while throwing your lead hand shot. This is going to allow you to exit at an angle while simultaneously counter punching them. But another thing that Izzy likes to do is that along with this, he'll actually follow up with another lead hook right after his lateral step check hook. You can see he's going to step out laterally and then throw that power shot. And then as Whittaker falls into range, he's going to follow up with another fading hook. You're going to want to keep this in mind because it's important. So here Izzy feints to bait Rob forward. Then as Rob comes forward, Izzy does a lateral step and check hook, then fires another fading hook counter once Rob falls into his range. In the rematch, Izzy attempted this multiple times. You would see Izzy bait Rob forward and then he would throw his lateral step, check hook signature, following with another fading hook. Amazingly, Rob did not get caught clean once on his chin this time around, and it speaks volumes to his maturity as a fighter. He learned to be careful engaging in the pocket, but most importantly, he's learned to not get greedy once he's in range. This is the reason why Izzy couldn't connect his shots. Rob didn't allow himself to overcommit like he did last time, attempting to throw that cross or attempting to work prolonged exchanges in the pocket. However, this explains why he was apprehensive to fire the cross off. Engaging in prolonged exchanges inside is what got him in trouble in the first place. One of the issues that I mentioned in my previous video was that it can be very dangerous exchanging punches with the longer fighter inside the pocket, because at any point they can fade back out of range and they can hit you while you can't hit them. This is something that Nate Diaz did quite often against Michael Johnson. He would bait him forward with the jab and then lean back and connect with his fading lead hook right into his safe range. Similarly, here is where Izzy and Rob get into an exchange, and Izzy simply fades back into a safe range highlighted in the purple, and then he makes Rob hit his shots as Rob misses. This is a unique attribute about Izzy that he's used against various opponents. Rob was a lot more mindful about getting greedy in the pocket. You'd often see multiple times where Izzy would attempt to throw his fading lead hook, only to find himself missing. Rob's defensive technique was surprisingly on point. He always had his guard up during and after his entries. People may not have liked the fact that Rob wouldn't strike further beyond his double jab though. Even Rob's corner mentioned their frustrations of Rob not following his jabs with the cross. For the jabs that he even did manage to land, he wouldn't normally follow them up with power shots like his corner wanted him to. You have to consider that the alternative might have resulted in him walking into Izzy's hook counters. For example, here Izzy throws his signature lateral step check hook, and then he follows it up with another fading lead hook counter. Rob came in with his double jab and even grazed Izzy's face, but he decided not to follow up with the cross, especially after what happened in the first fight. If he had thrown the cross like he did last time, there was a strong likelihood he would have repeated history again and eaten the counter based off of the evidence of this fight. As a matter of fact, this is the shocking part of the fight that I realized even as I write this very part of the script. In almost all fight sequences that I observed Izzy attempting his signature counter, Rob would pivot out instead every single time after landing his double jab, and if he had attempted his cross, he would have almost certainly gotten hit by Izzy's fading lead hook counter. Throwing the cross puts your head into the trajectory of the lead hook from what I saw in the first fight, and by Rob choosing to defensively pivot out to evade instead, he was able to evade the shot by a few inches, and this was pretty amazing. To me, I give Rob a tremendous amount of respect for his defensive ability to play this dangerous game of inches. So at the end of the day, yes, I understand people's frustration with Rob not firing that cross very much, but likewise I fully understand Rob's caution after feeling the wind of Izzy's hook just barely grazing his face multiple times throughout the sequences. This fight was not easy for either of these guys, and I think Izzy's reaction at the end can attest to how crafty Rob was. He was pushed to the technical limit to solve a fight that was not easy to solve. Izzy said in the end that this fight elevated his game, and I have to say that I agree with that. Both Rob and Izzy walk away from this fight better fighters, and that's scary because they were already the two best at the very top. It wasn't enough to simply feint and bait Whittaker to come forward. Whittaker is very smart, and in my previous breakdown of Whittaker vs Tail, I spoke about how Rob is a great fighter to study in handling feinters and baiters. In that breakdown, I mentioned one of the reasons why it's hard to bait Whittaker. When you attempt to feint or bait someone, you're looking for them to give you some kind of pattern to work off of. However, in principle, if you constantly change the defensive pattern that you use, it fundamentally makes it very hard for the opponent to predict how they can attack you with their feints. For example, when Izzy was trying to look to feint and bait Rob into coming forward, Rob didn't always bite with the same reactions. Like here for example, sometimes he'll retreat back when Izzy feints, or he'll actually advance forward when Izzy feints. It's a pretty frustrating process because it's hard for Izzy to read what Whittaker was actually going to do. Izzy can't clearly tell if Rob is going to collide or retreat. I did see one instance where Izzy would bait Rob forward into his own uppercut. It was pretty useful for catching Rob's head because Rob usually sips his head off of the center line while he's coming in with his double jab. However, I found Izzy abandoned this option entirely. Izzy is tall, so when he throws the uppercut, he does leave his head open for that jab. Rob could just stun his head with the jab and leave him open for other following shots. As a result, Izzy didn't really try the uppercut again after this one instance. Rob noticed that Izzy was trying to bait him out so that he could counter him, but he had a few unique moments of trying to counter this. Rob would counter this by acting as though he was going to actually bite on the bait by throwing a shot, but then quickly stop his attack to cover up and wait for Izzy to counter, and then he would fire his own counter after Izzy left the opening. I've only seen Rob do this a small handful of times and probably only found success with this maybe just once. It was effective, but it was risky because it required taking a shot just to give one back. It's possible he could have built a strategy around this, but taking a shot to give one back doesn't seem like the wisest option. Even though Rob was the one predominantly waiting for Izzy, it wasn't fully one-sided like that. Rob had some good moments as the one initiating the exchanges himself on some occasions. For example, this particular tactic where Rob would fake a jab and then set up a lead hook. This was a pretty useful tactic that Jan found success with too, faking that jab and then going into a lead hook to close that distance. This works because Izzy has a tendency to reach out, so if you could fake a jab, you could draw him to reach out, and this will leave his arm out so that he can follow up for lead hook when he leaves that opening. Could Rob have done more? Quite possibly. There were a few things out of Jan's book that seemed to pay off as well. For example, Rob's corner wanted him to time his attack when Izzy would switch his stance. He was able to capitalize on this in this example here where Izzy changes his stance. Rob capitalizes by advancing with his shot. This usually works because when you time your shots, you might be able to catch them before their feet are even properly set to respond. And since Izzy does switch his stance quite often, this can prove to be useful. We also saw a glimpse of this from Jan too, where he's able to attack Izzy during his stance switch. The nice addition for Rob's end was him mixing in takedowns. From this fight, we learned that the takedowns may or may not have been as useful as we thought. Rob timed good takedowns, but Izzy did a great job of scrambling back to the feet. He did a great job making good use of the cage by always moving towards it and using it as leverage so they could strip Rob off. And then he would typically do things like stick in an overhook and create space on one side so they could shove off at an angle. So it does kind of make you wonder, are Rob's wrestling attempts even worth it, and would you still even recommend it? Overall, the story of this fight was dictated by Izzy as the one who initiated the sequences. However, whoever executed their tactics cleanly saw the better end of those exchanges, and we saw this in how Izzy was able to use his hip feint to open up his knockdown, and to some degree we saw how he was able to bait Rob into his own kicks. Likewise, Rob showed several good moments of judgment in his ability to recognize what Izzy was doing by timing his entries when Izzy was most vulnerable during his feints, and showing good judgment by not getting greedy in the sequences that would have gotten him knocked out. This fight highlights a unique level of fight IQ that you don't get to see quite often in the middleweight division. Now consider this, these two fighters are on a completely different level than the rest of the division. You don't get to see them fight each other often, but when you do, you're going to see some high level interactions take place. And even though it lacks some activity, when you take a closer look at what actually happened, it reveals a shocking truth about the intelligence of the fighters. I personally would not have realized how defensively sound Rob was against those very specific counters that dropped him in the first fight if I had not studied this fight closely, or even noticed how good Izzy was at adapting to Rob. There was some controversy surrounding this fight about who won, but as usual I'm more interested in how this fight played out from a technical perspective and what we can learn from it. So that's been the focus of this video. Follow me on my website for more content. I still have the Max Holloway vs Yair Rodriguez fight analysis up if you want to watch it. Subscribe to my newsletter for updates on projects and random technical stuff about fighting. If you thought this was good, please consider sharing this because it really helps out. Thanks a lot for watching. I appreciate all the support. Have a good one.